ratings that did not exist at the time in Japan. Well, it didn't really work, and shonenai and shoujoi by that time, which is now the 1990s on the internet, were terms that were mostly used by pederasts and pedophiles, so they didn't really work. Shoujoi kind of became popular, but it really needed to go away as fast as we could. And because of the history of Yuri, because the term was created by Ito Bunkaku, which we'll talk about in a second, to represent lesbians, I wanted to recapture the lesbian connection, and I and many other people at the time chose Yuri. Now, because BL, boys love, is so popular, GL is also being used by publishers. So if you see people using GL, it's mostly a publisher coined term. They like the simplicity of it, the easy to understand quality. I am not a big fan of it precisely because it is publisher termed, and the audience and the creators tend to use Yuri. And also, lastly, queer or LGBTQ plus manga. This is manga by and about sexual and gender minorities. It is a separate thing, like gay comics. It's considered a separate thing from BL and Yuri in Japan, and I also consider it a separate thing because of the acknowledgement of identity. So that's the terminology, and we're all working hopefully on the same exact terminology. And I don't know why this is not working, but we're going to go this way. Okay. All right. So one of the things that I used to be told all the time was that yaoi and Yuri, were opposite sides of the same coin. And this screenshot is actually from Skull-Faced bookseller Honda-san, which I do recommend. It's a terrific anime about bookselling in Japan. But what we now call BL gained popularity in the US in the 2000s. So you saw it at conventions. There were a lot of panels about it. There's still a lot of panels about it. And of course, a lot of fan art and artist alleys. And at that time, Yuri was just beginning to be talked about. By the time Yuri really became known, I kept frequently hearing that they were opposite sides of the same coin. And it always bothered me, because what exactly is opposite about Yuri and yaoi, except the gender of the characters? How does that make the stories of same-sex love, or the idea of love and romance, opposite? And if you think about it, and this is why I'm making this thing, it's really, this just pisses me off, okay? If you think about it, really what we're saying when we say they're opposite sides, we're saying that men and women are fundamentally incomprehensible others to each other. And I tend to hear opposite sides of the same coin as an assumption of that patriarchal standard that men and women can never really understand each other or like the same things. And I'm going to come back to that over and over. These two things are opposite only because primarily women like BL, which was about men and romantic and sexual relationships. And naturally, I was told repeatedly that only men liked Yuri because, of course, it's about sex between women. And I just never bought it. So today I really want to talk about all the things Yuri and BL have in common, and why I don't think they're opposite sides of the same coin at all. If anything, they're just the same side of the same coin. But once we say that, we could just throw the whole coin analogy out. And BL and Yuri are, in fact, much the same thing. They are stories of same-sex relationships, and the only real difference is the paths they took to evolution. So I just want to start with, when I talk about the history, I always use pictures by Takabataka Kasho, whose art was early 20th century, and who I have to say just does the most beautiful homoerotic, lovely pictures. And I highly recommend you look up Takabataka Kasho art, really beautiful Taisho period stuff. So Taisho period Japan, we're talking the 1920s, late 1910s, early 20s, came from a Japan that was rapidly adopting Western technology, medicine, including psychology and education, the aesthetic that we are all very familiar with, that created the tropes that set sort of the base tropes of both BL and Yuri. So we have foreign run, schools, they're run by religious orders, they're schools in exotic places with intense emotional environments, because of course it's all same sex, a perfect place for emotions to get wildly out of control. This set up a trope that was perfect for the next phase of evolution, when women who had grown up reading girls manga drawn mostly by men wanted to tell stories for themselves. They took these exotic places and exotic periods of time. So during this period of time, the world was undergoing several social movements. And now I just, without even speaking about it, I just literally left an entire half century. I went from like the 20s to like the 60s. Hope you don't get whiplash. The student protests against the wars in Vietnam raged across not only the US, but also Japan. And the so-called sexual revolution was gaining steam as women were able to gain bodily autonomy with birth control. So manga and art scenes were full of experimental work. And primarily, when I say experimental, because I am a raging feminist, I mean men going, look, penises, breasts, it's all really tiresome when people tell you something's experimental and all you see is like a 6-year-old going, woo, naked women. So into the mix of this world that was having this revolution of art and literature, we have a group of people who we now call the Magnificent 49ers. And of course, they did not set out to change the manga world, but they did have ideas they wanted to explore, including tales of same-sex relationships. Yamagishi Ryoko's Shiroihei no Futari, Takamiya Keiko's Kaza Tokino Uta, Moto Hagio's Toma no Shinzo. Those are all stories that were had a few key concepts in common. They're all set somewhere else. Most of them are set somewhen else. I mean, I read Heart of Thomas, and I have to say, I have no idea when. It's after trains. You know what I'm saying? Like that we know because there's trains, but we don't know anything else. Like there's no way to know. It's sort of like in Princess Bride. It's like after Europe, but before, sandwiches or whatever. So you have this problem where these places are exotic but unreal. And that makes it a very safe space to explore topics that we don't want to talk about, things that we don't want to sit down and try to explain to our mom, or not yet at least, things that we want to explore and not have any necessarily repercussions because it's art and it's fiction. So what happened was BL becomes very popular in Japan, obviously, and there's not really a lot of blowback except for the word fujoshi. And I've talked about this a couple of times. I don't have a separate slide on this, but I really do want to sort of mention this. Yes, Takabataka Kasho is the artist's name. Thank you very much, BL Party. So the word fujoshi, rotten woman, I know you all know that. If you think about what makes a woman rotten, what makes a woman rotten is her sudden interest in something that is not her husband or family. And that is it. They're not rotten because they like to be titillated, although women having a sex drive still confuses many people. What makes them rotten is that they're taking any time and attention away from the things they must care about, being a good wife and a wise mother. And that is why, and that is the only reason, yes, we are mysterious creatures, the only reason we have the word fujoshi is because how dare you have an interest in something else? So the main trope of these stories is the exoticization of the whole thing. And that's not a real word, and I had to explain to Word that I wanted to use it anyway, exoticization. So what you have here is women finding titillation in something they had never considered before, and to make it safe, you have to make it some when and somewhere that are not real. It's very important that these things be not real. These stories took place in foreign places, at schools that were run by Western religious organizations, and they were often in different times than the present. So If you look at Toma no Shinzo, you're looking at a who knows when after trains. But if you look at something like Shiroi Hinafatari, it's in France. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's France, but where? When? I know, okay, to some extent you can tell when if you read the whole story, particularly because of the ending, which takes place when Simone loses her mind, goes to a bar, picks a fight, and gets stabbed, which is classic lesbian behavior. So I really appreciated that. So you have this ideal that the boys' love is exotic and cool, right? So it comes here to the West. And I want to say that there's a lot of blurriness about where and when, but there's also a lot of blurriness about the characters too. So the gender of the characters is well known that Moto Hagio first considered having her characters be girls in November Gymnasium, but rejected that for boys. BL scholar Mizuguchi Akiko has spoken on the subject of BL quite extensively, that portrays male characters as all but female. And if you look at some artists, particularly in the 90s and thousands, again, you get the twinky, sort of very flowy hair, long hair, beautifully effete. I don't want to say effeminate because that's a different thing and that's used differently. And then, of course, a lot of BL and also Yuri cross-dresses characters to provide extra gender blurriness. So you've got this sort of very in-between space of where and when and how, and it's so all very, very exotic. The point of this is that the point of these stories was how foreign and exotic they were. These could never have been stories that were set in places and times that the audience knew. They had to be somewhere and when that was out of reach of memory or understanding. In effect, early BL and Yuri were always once upon a time in a far-off land. And when these stories reached the West, the actual setting for many of the stories, right, because France or New York, as in New York, or fake or something, that need for exoticism and even fetishizing had to continue. And this is something that most people don't really think about. The audience here in the US, and I'm doing primarily US, although I think it's valid for most of the West, but I'm going to say the US and North America, that was the group of people I was most familiar with, was very little different than those in Japan, where younger women had access to BL magazines and they were used to this idea. Here, the audience originally for BL was mostly older adult women, middle-aged adult women with computer access and time. These adult women found it thrilling to read stories of pretty boys from Japan, and the foreignness of the creation took place of the foreignness of the setting. When Yuri began to be spoken of 15 years later, there was a backlash from these women. As straight women, they tended to be male-focused and interested in men for themselves, and they often saw female characters as a distraction or an intrusion. That's also been talked about a lot in BL circles. And the idea of homosexuality in a real way often repulsed these women. And there were incidents, there were many incidents actually, both online and in the real world, where queer folks found themselves rejected from spaces where BL and GL or early Yuri were being talked about as they had been from straight spaces. So you'd get like forums where we're going to talk about Yuri, and a queer woman might come on and they'd be like, "You're not wanted here," or early days in Yaoi-Con where some queer men had found themselves fetishized and exoticized but not respected as human beings. So that is a thing that actually happened. So this is this space where the argument that BL is versus GL actually began. And surely we had to, these people would tell me, surely these things are antagonists to each other because they are fundamentally opposed. But I discovered a compelling argument that made me understand that this is not true. People can actually like more than one thing at a time at the same time. And this is the thing that really made me understand that, like, I was not talking to people who were arguing reasonably, right? It's huge if true, yes. I mean, people can like stuff, right? And here's the important part. A lot of young queer women were reading BL because that what was available. They didn't have access to Yuri. They didn't have access to other queer things. Trans women, trans men are looking for what they can find. And a lot of them just ended up in BL, and that's true for the creators in Japan as well, which we'll touch on in a second. So here's the thing. One of the things that BL did, now we're talking like into the 21st century, and this is really kind of key because the 90s was like, oh, BL exists, and then 2000s like, it's not going away. It's still a major part of the publishing. There's dozens of magazines, I mean, like dozens and dozens of magazines on the shelves. And what happened was, even from the beginning, BL creators were often themselves queer women. They used the material to explore themes that they couldn't explore in mainstream manga, of familial and social ostracization, the difficulties in relationships, power dynamics, of course. Stories of unequal power dynamics is super popular in BL, particularly in early days. So you've got a lot of place for women to explore themes that were important to them of manipulation and abuse and coercion and rape without making women the target. And so all those things are super critical. Because Yuri came a little bit later, and basically BL had about 15 years on it, which means it's sort of like a big sibling of Yuri. Because Yuri came later, many of these themes really didn't get picked up on in popularity. So what worked for an audience between two men didn't between two women. And when publishers tried to just port the sort of the manipulation and the non-consensual rape and all that kind of stuff over, the audience rejected it because a lot of the audience was women, and they didn't like seeing that same stuff with women as the victim. Seeing a man as a victim made it less intolerable. Sort of interesting. Both readers and creators could find ways of cross-dressing or queering their characters, and that gave creators and readers a chance to sort of play with queering, but also sometimes exploitation, which is interesting because when it was the 90s and 2000s, and I would comment very often at the time that BL at the time, looking at these non-consensual stories, and let's be honest, they were stories of rape and manipulation and coercion. I would say, well, this is no different than porn, and a lot of the fans would be like, "How dare you?" But I'd be like, "Well, what's the difference, other than the victim is a apparent man as opposed to an apparent woman?" And they would like, it's different because, and the answer is different because they didn't want to think about it. So the exploitation angle is a real angle. So the 21st century became a place where you start to see creators opening up about their queerness and about the place that BL and Yuri has made for stories, queer stories in mainstream media and given space in queer media. So this is a bit of thought for you guys, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit here. There's a very, very, very good book. I strongly recommend reading it. It's called Queer Transfiguration, Boys Love Media in Asia. If you are interested in the history or fandom of BL, I strongly recommend this book. I thought it was an amazing book. It's a lot of different essays. So I wanted to talk about that. And I have written a book on the history of Yuri, and my book has a different perspective because I'm openly queer, and Queer Transfigurations has some queer and some straight writers. And it was very interesting to me. Here's why. Many years ago, I was at a convention, a major convention, with a group of queer comics enthusiasts. So that was great. One of the folks was a young gay man, and he and I got into a conversation where he kind of expressed that he was disappointed with BL at the time. He didn't like the twink look. He was looking for masculine men in his BL. And obviously that has changed quite a lot now, but at the time the stereotype was the sort of, artist seme, the effete artist, neurotic seme, and the very, very feminine uke. So I said at the time we could probably find him something he'd like. And I took him to a company table that was a major publisher at the time. And I said to the very straight men behind the table, I said, he would like something with like masculine men. And they all stood there. There were like 4 straight men, and very seriously went through all their titles to discuss what he might like. And he went away so happy, but also because his need and desire had been completely respected by straight men, probably something that had never, ever happened to him. He loved their choices, and hopefully we made a BL fan that day. So what I want to talk about right now is the limits of non-queer folks in our queer spaces. And some of you, I'm sure, are not queer yourselves, and I'm not trying to diss you at all. Hopefully I'll present this in a very fair way. But a lot of BL researchers in queer transfigurations refer to the queering of non-queer work when non-queer people find same-sex relationships in various works. So supernatural, right? There, I think that's a very popular one, right? So you're a straight woman, you watch Supernatural, you go, whoa, I want to read a comic about the two of them, right? So that seems very, very queer, but is it really actually queer, or is it exploitation? So here's the question: is it queer if this is, and I'm gonna let you unmute yourselves and see if any of you want to answer this. Is a story, let's start with this question, is a story queer if non-queer folks ship couples in BL or Yuri? Does anybody want to take a stab at that? Go ahead, Samantha. Why don't you unmute and tell us what you think, if you're allowed. Okay. I'm not defining queer on purpose, because nobody has defined queer or queering. It's not a thing that can be defined. So, okay, Samantha, what do you think? Is it queer? Is it queer if non-queer folks ship couples in BL or Yuri?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi. Yeah, personally, I've come to strongly believe that it is, especially because I've encountered so many people, including myself, who are what you would call late bloomers, and so especially if they're pan or bi, they just assume, oh, I'm straight, that kind of background.
Mm-hmm.
And so even just playing with narratives from stories growing up, where I enjoyed reading cross-dressing shoujo stories where the girl, go to an all-boys school for whatever reason, and then you have some boys falling in love with her, thinking she's a guy, and having those inner turmoils, while at the same time you have girls falling for her, thinking she's actually also thinking she's a guy. And so and like that just compelled the hell out of me when I was like 15. I was like, oh my God, it's me.
But and let me just butt you here.
Yeah.
Are those people not queer then? Because you're saying they're latent queers, and valid, totally valid, because that leads into the next question, which I think that was great. Thank you, Sam. And I'm gonna leave the next question, let somebody else take a stab at this. Is it queering if queer folks ship couples in BL or Yuri? Does anybody have a thought there? Does anybody want to jump in and answer that with okay, if nobody wants to take this on, and we have some answers in the chat, but if nobody has any,
I can read them. I can read them if you'd like me to.
No, it's okay. We have answers in the chat. We could say, excuse me, I'll read one here. No, Mike, personally, I love when non-queer folks enjoy queer ships because it means they're not blind to those possibilities. Oops, I can't do this. Let's see. I'm just going to say, I can think of a minor newspaper strip when a major character was incredibly obviously a lesbian, but straight women don't dress like them on purpose, which, boom, I love that. And half the audience was blindsided when she confessed to another female lead. So that's an interesting perspective, absolutely. The other thing, too, when queer folks ship couples, there's the question of representation. So if you're reading a BL or Yuri, which in theory should be openly, openly queer, but you know, BL Yuri often isn't, particularly earlier BL Yuri, where like identity didn't exist and we only were in love with this person and never had seen another person ever, and never had any thoughts beyond that person. But maybe what's happening there is also this person who is reading, the reader is becoming more queer, becoming more aware of their identity. So I think maybe not the content is being queered, but the person is being queered. Okay, so is it queer if queer folks find queer content in otherwise straight stories? Does anybody want to stand up and talk about that? Hongo's husband, you said you're interested. Yes, okay. Let's get Hongo's husband because I just see that. Do you want to answer that one? Okay.
Sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So before I answer this question, can I ask you, do you know about Beauty and the Beast?
The television show, the movie, the original.
And also The Little Mermaid. So when we see queer folks finding queer content in straight stories, it's because we know there is. Like The Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast, like they're completely straight. Like, you know, Ariel marries Prince Eric, the Beast gets with Belle, happy ever after, male and female. But there is always some form of queer subtext and a lot of stories. And sometimes it can also be because of the background. Like The Little Mermaid, not only was the person who made the songs Howard Ashman, which, you know, made Part of Your World.
They're a very gay man, yes.
But also Hans Christian Andersen, the original creator, his whole story was about a man he loved and he could never reciprocate it back, which is pretty much like, you know, the
story, right? That's the gay story.
Yeah, happy fairy tales are actually bad, yada yada yada. But it actually is inherently queer, and that's like its queer identity in it. And like how the Beast is like more, unlike The Little Mermaid, which is like long history, Beauty and the Beast is more modern because the Beast is like an allegory for like men dying for the AIDS epidemic and how they are slowly seen as a monster because of like, you know, oh, you have AIDS, you're automatically homosexual, you must be like damned to death. And it's like,
well, I think that's an interesting reading, but not not necessarily historically accurate. It's quite significantly older than the Disney movie, right? So,
oh yeah,
and we have the story as Cocteau envisioned it, where the Beast was just an animal in human form. And so, yes, you can read that maybe into the Disney version, but we have to acknowledge that it's an older story than that.
Yeah, I'm just abridging it because I don't want to like completely go on a rant, but like Howard Ashman like wrote the Beauty and the Beast 1991 version with the idea of like, you know, like he's a gay man, he's dying of AIDS, he died before he even got to see Beauty and the Beast come to life fully.
Right.
Like it's kind of like that straight story is actually more inherently queer because it really is about like a queer person, like the Beast is the gay man dying of AIDS. Of course he marries Belle, but like a lot of queer people can read that, and that's like what makes it powerful. And then there's Aladdin in the Ashman trilogy, but Aladdin's not really that much because he unfortunately passed away. But that's my take on queer folks finding content in straight stories.
Cool. Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. Great comments. So we have one last one, which is, you know, something to think about. It doesn't matter if Fisher Stalker wants to know what's the matter. It doesn't matter. It's just something to think about. This whole panel is about things to think about. There's absolutely no meaning here other than, So how is the story queer when non-queer folks, straight folks, and not people who are blatantly queer or gay or whatever, but people who are genuinely heterosexual, cisgender, how is it queering if they find queer content in otherwise straight stories? And I don't want anyone to answer that. I want you to think about that. I want you to think about what does that mean to media? What does it mean to the power of media? I mean, there's no right answer here. There's no right answer here. This was just some thoughts to have some fun. So I think fandom, one of the strengths of fandom, is that it has a tremendous amount of room for the queering of media. And I started as a fanfic writer. Yeah, you know, me. But from my perspective, claiming that folks enjoying queer or queered media makes it harder sometimes, rather than easier, for queer folks to find space in those fandoms. And I have seen that with my own eyes, where you have a group of otherwise straight people going, no, this is for us, not for you. And you're like, but you're queering these two characters, I should be allowed. And they're like, no, but you're icky. And that's why I say there's this weird dichotomy between some fans saying, BL is exotic and cool, but Yuri is gross, or BL is cool, but gay men are gross, or Yuri is cool, but queer women are gross. And I want you to think about how people within fandom react to the queering of their media, how they react to people being queer and queering their media. And that's all this panel is, just sort of make you think about things. Because, and here's my point, BL and Yuri are, to some extent, the story of queer folks making space for themselves in a hostile world. And they're also the story of non-queer folks using those spaces for themselves and often giving themselves queer cred for doing so. So while BL and Yuri have different audiences, they have different creators. Sometimes they have similar creators. They have different needs, but I do not think in any way they are the opposite. And this, because of this, I say Yuri and BL are not opposite sides of the same coin at all, not even a little. It's the same story, the same challenges, the same victories. And the only difference, frankly, is whether you like boys or girls as the protagonist. And that's my presentation. So I am open to questions. I'm going to unshare the screen and put my beautiful haha face here. And you are welcome to, Ash, if you have any questions that you saw.
The only question that I saw, someone in the chat answered, which was the artist's name, the Taisho artist. So
Okay,
that's all I had on my
Taisho.
side.
Okay, so if any of you have any questions, let's have them. I'm glad. What kind of resources do I use for my research? Lived experience, baby. I was there in the early 90s and 2000s and 2010s, and I'm still there in the middle of fandom. The other sources for things like the Magnificent 49ers is I'm a comparative literature major back a million years ago. I am not a historian. So I'm mostly using what I've read from the actual works by the creators and of course some history about the Magnificent 49ers, which I think is pretty well known. And I would recommend some of the essays on the Hooded Utilitarian, which is a blog that I don't even know if it exists anymore, but there's a lot of stuff. Thank you for loving my shirt. My shirt is a design that I have. I no longer have a Redbubble store. I pulled it down when they decided that the new economic standard was that we make no money. So when I get a new store up, I'll let you know what that is. Yes, I saw G-Witch, and I loved. Why don't you? I'm sorry, Illness Illusion. Why don't you go ahead and type it, and I'll read it. Yes, I did love this Mobile Suit Gundam, the Witch for Mercury, known to fandom as G-Witch. I thought it was excellent. What I did not think was excellent was Bandai Namco apologizing for saying the obvious, which is that Suletta, Miura, and at the end are married. And I wondered to whom they were apologizing, because fandom wasn't happy that they apologized. So that was confusing. I think they probably were apologizing to some politician who wrote a nasty message, but that's me. Okay, is there a hand raise feature? I don't know. There should be. You can probably raise your hand. Okay, Hongo's husband, let's have it.
Hi, I actually recently made a video about Yuri and Girls Love, and I do know that Yuri and Girls Love has a good history of in ties with queer women in Japan. How there's first one of the pioneers was an actual lesbian, but I'm also wondering about BL. There's some rumors that I saw around the 90s and 2000s, some BL writers picked up on what gay men were saying, because that was where gay identities were being more and more invisible thanks to the widespread communication. So is there a little anything related to queer history in there, or
buy my book?
Will that also cover BL, or?
No, it doesn't cover BL, but it does talk about the history of how things have developed. When you say the creator of Yuri, that's not exactly correct. The woman that I personally decided was the grandmother of Yuri, the godmother of Yuri, Yoshino Buko. She was, in fact, actually a lesbian, but Yuri developed over time in the 1930s in girls' magazine culture, and in the 50s through comics for girls by men, and then again with the 70s women taking up roles, writing their own comics, and then again in the 90s, and then in 2000s, 2010s, and 11s, 20s. So it's a very complicated history. You can't really point to this one moment in time and say it started here, although I do anyway, for reasons which I explain in the book. The thing is, BL was around sooner. Okay, it has 15 years of existence as a genre before Yuri. So everything that happens with BL, it's developing an economic structure, it's developing a market, an audience, it's developing advertising, a genre. People know what it is. So of course, when Yuri comes in, a lot of publishers tried to port the one into the other, and it didn't quite work. And there were reasons why it didn't work. Again, I do talk about those reasons. And there are things that did work with Yuri. And so Yuri has its own tropes, as well as having new tropes at this point. So it's a different sort of history. BL was one thing. It was by women for a female audience. It was a subgenre of josei and shoujo, so it was for women and for girls. Whereas Yuri doesn't have that. It's actually can be seen as a feature in all the other genres, and so it has pieces of the tropes from seinen and shoujo and josei and shonen has absorbed into it. Plus, as an extra bonus, you have queer women writing Yuri as well as men writing Yuri. So you have is a very heterogeneous genre. It doesn't have the same kind of evolution that BL has. So as a result, it's a much more complex flavor, I guess is what I'm looking for. So I would highly recommend reading my book. It takes you all the way through the history and explains the why of all of that. Ixer 1, yes, I loved Ixer 1 too. Let's see, going back here. I don't know if anything else that I have here. 33% of BL readers read Yuri, and a lot of Yuri readers read BL. I am not one of them, because, and not for any particular reason other than the fact that I am not interested in men particularly. I'm not anti-man, and I have plenty of male friends. I have many men who are friends with mine, but I'm just simply uninterested in them. So as protagonists, I would much rather watch women do literally anything than watch men do anything. Let's see. I noticed in my blog I talk about female versus male demographics. So the thing is, there was an assumption in the 1990s that Yuri is for men. It's by men, it's for men, it's sex, it's porn. And that was never entirely true. Ever. Nothing is ever entirely true. Really, everything anybody says when you get somebody who makes things reductive, if they're not going weak butt, then they don't really understand things. Reductive thinking is childish. And what happened was there were a lot of female Yuri fans, and then you had this huge, big, massive wave of women who were interested in Yuri because of Sailor Moon, because of Haruka Michiru. And that changes things when this thing becomes popular. So now you have all these women as Yuri fans, and openly as you're doing doujinshi. And this is what I mean when I say like openly, because you're not walking around the street going, I'm a Yuri fan. You're making, buying, selling doujinshi or comics or something. And it's getting more and more popular. And I literally watched the Yuri section of Komiket grow from like a couple of tables to a whole section. And the last time I went to Komitia, which was in 2019, rows and rows and rows of original Yuri. And I'm going back this December, and I can't wait to see what it's become. So you can't make reductive comments about that, but you can say that because of its history, Yuri is probably most likely to be the one genre that has a basically fairly even ratio of male identified to female identified fans. I hope that makes some sense. I have many friends. I have plenty of things. Symphogear, and that's a big one. Sailor Moon really was. I can't express to you how much of a game changer Sailor Moon was. Not just in terms of Yuri at all, but in terms of shoujo, I mean, I just recently did some work, a huge project, which is coming out next year, a chapter of a book, and I commented that Sailor Moon, along with Fruits Basket, made comics for girls. It put it on the wall in a way that never had happened before here in the West. And that was really the huge thing that it changed. So I feel like current fandom culture is people interested in whatever's popular. That is true all the time, every time. Whatever's popular is always going to be what's popular. There's a reason why it's popular. Shonen Jump has a formula on making things popular. They literally have a formula. And that was actually what made Sailor Moon so different, is that they adopted the shonen formula for popularity. They're like, first we're going to get these girls. They're going to be a team. They're going to have a bunch of emotional bonds, and then they will go and they will fight bad guys, but make friends of those bad guys, at least some of them, and they'll be empathetic and will care about them. And so they literally, the editor literally said, okay, what's the Shonen Jump formula? We're going to use that for Sailor Moon, which is one of the reasons it became so popular. Yes, Mutsumi Natsuo has a Kickstarter called Boyish Squared Butch Yuri Anthology, and this is the second volume. There's a first volume you can still get on their website. It is all Butch stories, and I highly recommend it. I love the first one. I might even have it right here. Hang on. Oh, look, right here. So here's the first one. Oh, you're gonna want the front of the book. There you go. That's Boyish, and the second one is international. So it has writers and creators from Japan, from the US, and from Canada, which is really super honest. Is the BL and yaoi scene of cons dying? Is it dying, or has it been absorbed into the mainstream? And that's a really interesting question about what makes a marginalized community. When you can get BL anywhere, you don't need a specialized BL table, right? If you can talk about BL anywhere, then you don't need specialized discussions. So that actually ties into something we were talking about earlier about like the bar scene, the lesbian bar scene is dying. And yes, it's true, because lesbian lives have been mainstreamed. I don't need to go to a bar to meet other lesbians. I can go online, and here's the key: not go to a lesbian space, but go to my favorite comic website, or my favorite anime forum, or talk on Twitter to folks and just get to meet people. And that has changed a huge dynamic in terms of marginalization. So when evil stepdaddy Elon took over Twitter and a lot of people left, you saw like Black Twitter move to Blackstodon over on Mastodon, because you have this community that's thriving. And it doesn't have to be super marginalized. It can be right here out in the public eye, and we can just try to port it somewhere where it's a little less unwelcome, right? So is it dying, or is it being mainstreamed? It's a really interesting question. It's not visible, but that's because it's not separated out. And that's what I'm saying. The last time I went to a con, Hendane is still screaming yaoi wrong. There's still people selling it, but what you don't have is that kind of separate, oh, look, we are banding together, because it's just out there. It's accepted. It's one of the weird things about the anime manga community, is that it's fairly accepting of sexual and gender minorities. And so marginalization sort of passes through a little less harshly than in, say, sports, something like that. I'm afraid of cis men take over Yuri. No, because you should be, because I took it over from them. Ha ha ha. And I put that on film, and it's going to be there forever. I'm going to say that forever. I spent most of the 90s telling men, no, Yuri is not for you. It is for whoever wants it. And even now, when I see people saying Yuri is for lesbians, Yuri is for this. No, Yuri is for anybody who likes it. What the fuck? It's for literally anybody who's enjoying it. Just, I don't understand people. That's all I could say. Yuri is forever. And for anyone. There you go. Let me go through here. Yes, and also Natsuo Sensei has My Day as a Total Ike Woman, which I also have over here, but I have to dig it out. Let's see. What do I think about Yuri being female versus male demographics? I think I covered that. The answer is it's because of its heterogeneous origins, it's like a really mixed, I mean, it's really, when I started talking about Yuri as a genre, and this was long before we accepted it as a genre, one of the things that I said is Yuri is by anyone, Yuri's for anyone, and it really doesn't matter who brings the drinks to the party. And that was my motto back at YuriCon. It was my motto now. It is my motto every day. It's a very, here's the thing, and this is so important to me. I'm not chicken. Like, I don't care if you're a man, you're a woman, you're a trans man, you're a trans woman. Are you a fan of Yuri? Because that's the important point. And so if you identify so that I can find out, that's fine, but I am never going to ask. I can see based on our stats who basically is reading. I will say that at the beginning of this past year, I did a massive global survey on who is reading Yuri. And straight men are 24% of the population. Everything else is queer folks. And one of my folks on our Discord, over our Okazu Discord, they were kind of like, oh, I'm a minority. And I'm like, yeah, actually you are. But that's okay. It's fine because it doesn't matter. Everybody's welcome. If I have a personal preference or not, okay, I don't care. I like good stories. In fact, I just reviewed today a light novel called Other Side Picnic, Volume 8, and it's by a man, Iori Miyazawa, who I have to tell you is a master, an amazing freaking novel. And it's sci-fi horror, Yuri, absolutely outstanding. Other Side Picnic, 100%. Totally want you to read that. Gay Coney would be surprised at some of their favorite authors and women. That's true for a lot of men. A lot of men, I mean, there's an assumption in this world that we live in. Boys and men are raised to assume that all spaces are theirs. Some of them then assume that all spaces are theirs alone. And that there were never any women who did comics, and there were never any women who wrote science fiction, and there were never any women who were race car drivers, and there were never any women who did sports. And this is just a fact of existence. Women fight this every day of our lives, as we all know. The misogyny in sports is very high, but also in things like science fiction and things like manga. And you just have so many people who have no idea that their favorite mangaka is a woman. And that's partially because it's easier for people to take fake names. It's easier for people to take names that don't indicate their gender, so that they are left to not have to deal with the misogyny. They could just deal with the people who hate their story for hating their story, which is also annoying, but also totally acceptable. So it's interesting that people don't know what they don't know. And so a lot of young, and I'm using this word young when I really mean sort of emotionally immature people, just make assumptions based on my existence. My life is clearly universal. Everything that I've lived through, everybody's lived through, which is obviously not true, but a lot of people go through life like that. Let's see. So you were sure, Tori, if you want to unmute, let's give you a minute. Go ahead. I'm sorry, I'm still playing catch up here.
Okay, hopefully my audio's working all right.
Yep, it is fine.
Fantastic. So I think that, yes, absolutely, a story can be considered queer that was like made by an assumedly straight person if, like queer people see it. And I appreciate the historical example with Little Mermaid. I have more of a personal example to share. This is a bit more recent, but so I recently, I think tail end of last year, I got into Bleach. And I
respect the sound of shock that you use when you say that. Like, I can't believe it.
Yeah, no, I didn't expect it either. To my knowledge, the author of Bleach, Tite Kubo, is a straight man. To my knowledge. Don't know for sure. But I noticed a lot of behaviors in the main character of Bleach, Ichigo, that I related to a lot.
Fair.
I also found out I share the same personality type as him, which is a pleasant surprise. But it led me to the conclusion that, yeah, I think Ichigo is asexual, because I am also asexual, and some of the stuff he says and does in the show read to me as like asexual behavior.
Now, I have a question, and I'm not trying to be reductive. Would that not be because he, in the beginning, as a child?
It's honestly like it's a part of his like personality in
Okay.
general.
That's fair. Because remember that story, like I'm a big One Piece fan, although Naruto and Bleach sort of miss me. At the beginning of a story that's 20 years old, not only is the character older, but the readers are older and they're reading differently, you know what I'm saying? And there's nothing wrong with it, because I think that's cool. I think that's one of the powers of popular manga, is that we can see what we like in it, you know.
It's consistent throughout the story, though, that he's very he doesn't like, you know, I think the best way for me to explain this is to give an example. There is one scene where this one female character, Rangiku, who is very well endowed, let's say, lands on top of him. And normally, like, you would expect from like a shonen protagonist, or at least I've come to expect, some really like horny out of pocket comment,
right?
Like gross. Instead, Ichigo's response, and I'm quoting the dub here, he says, it was something along the lines of, can you get off of me? You're not exactly a lightweight, you know?
Yeah. Right.
And my first immediate thought was, God, that sounds like something I would say.
Right. And that's absolutely a valid reading. I mean, one of the things that's makes media powerful, and it's why when you are a part of a marginalized group, it is so extra important to see legitimate, you know, fair representation, right? Because, you know, it's fine to look at something and say, okay, I saw myself in that. There's a Yuri manga that came out a couple of years ago called Bloom Into You, and a ton of people were like, I see myself in these two characters, and particularly the main character, and saying, you know, I'm asexual, and that's fine. But in the end, that was not the actual real story. And I kept saying, as I was reading ahead in the Japanese, like, maybe don't hope that the manga is going to go where you wanted it to go. Maybe just go, I saw something important for me in that manga. It's very, very important. So I think we have time for one more question. Somebody asked me what my favorite Yuri manga is. My favorite Yuri manga is not in English, and I do not want you to go read scans. I dislike scans. And at this point, we are talking about an actual criminal act that just seems stupid, right? There's so much great Yuri manga. So instead of telling you my favorite Yuri manga, which you cannot get, I'm going to give you my second favorite Yuri manga, which is I'm in Love with the Villainess, which is not only an isekai, it is not only a high fantasy, it is not only a super great queer love story, but it is full of real life queer cred, like actual real queer stuff. So queer characters having conversations, straight people being told things about queer lives, which is extraordinary. And it just gets queer as it goes on. And then it gets even better. So I'm in Love with the Villainess. It's a series of manga. The creator is Inori Sensei. And in fact, I am going to be talking with her next week as part of YuriCon 2023. I am so excited. We've been planning this video interview for months and months and months, and I got sick, and then she got sick, and we just haven't been able to do it. So yay! So it's a manga and a light novel series. Both are out from Seven Seas. Highly, highly, highly recommended. I'm in Love with the Villainess. So that is and the anime is coming out this fall. That is correct. Hongo's husband. Cannot wait. So that's the answer to that question. And I think we got one more. If you got one more question here, is the manga good? The manga's great. The manga for I'm in Love with the Villainess, I think, is actually slightly better than the light novels because it doesn't leave out anything major. The art is better. It's really, really good. So that's good. All right. You're welcome. So do we have any other way? I think we could squeeze in one. And yes, the author of the novel, Inori Sensei, is just such a lovely person. She is so honest and decent. Someone wanted an answer to the third question. I don't know which question that was. Sorry, folks. Yeah, yes, they did. They got to answer the third question. So, okay. All right. Well, I'm going to say I want to thank you all very much for coming here today and being experimental guinea pigs in my new presentation. And I really appreciate your jumping in, all of you answering the questions I had for you and all of your thoughts. And you can see me. Hang on a second. I do have one other slide that I don't want to share here. I'm going to share my screen one more time. There we go. And let's go here. You can find me on all of these many exciting places. All right, fine. It's just not doing it. Here we go. So you can find me on my blog, Okazu. You can find me essays and interviews and stuff on YuriCon. I am on Patreon. None of my content on Patreon, or almost none of my content, is Patreon only, except for a very few like updates about life and stuff that way. But I do appreciate all your support. I am still on Twitter, but I'm also on Blue Sky, and I recommend moving over there because that is the lesser of two evils. And that's, I think, all we have. Thank you so much today. Thank you all for coming.